My father pointed to the chair beside the head table, staring right at me in front of nearly 100 guests. "That seat is for my real daughter," he announced. A second later, he shoved me onto the polished hardwood floor of the retirement party I thought I was attending to honor him. The dark blue silk of my late mother's dress twisted around my legs as her fragile bracelet shattered loudly against the wood. "My name is Kara Griffin, and I am 33 years old." Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of a lifetime of hard work, but as I stood at the entrance of Briar Glen Hall in Louisville, Kentucky, I felt a deep, unsettling chill. I gripped the arm of my husband, Owen Mercer, trying to steady my racing heart. The grand ballroom was draped in elegant silver and gold decorations, packed with nearly 90 guests. There were men in ill-fitting suits whom my father had spent his life working alongside at the Transit Authority, relatives I had not spoken to in years, and old family friends who had watched me grow up. I was wearing a dark blue silk dress. It had belonged to my late mother, Rachel Griffin. The fabric was soft and carried a faint, imaginary scent of vanilla and old books. Wearing her dress, along with her delicate vintage glass bracelet, was my silent way of bringing her spirit into a room that should have belonged to her just as much as it belonged to him. Douglas Griffin, a man of calloused hands, strict discipline, and quiet pride, was finally retiring. I had come to honor him, hoping to bridge the terrible, agonizing gap that had grown between us over the last 2 years. But the moment we stepped past the gilded entryway, the reality of my family situation hit me like a physical blow. I walked over to the ornate seating chart displayed on a velvet easel near the coat check. I ran my finger down the alphabetical list of names, scanning for my own at the family table. It was not there. Instead, taking up the most prominent space right next to my father's name was Sloane Harlow, the daughter of my stepmother, before I could even process the sting of being excluded. Meredith Harlow materialized through the crowd. My stepmother's smile was flawless, heavily glossed, and as cold as frosted glass. She wore a stunning emerald gown that looked far too expensive for a transit worker's retirement budget. "Kara," Meredith said, her voice dripping with a calculated, artificial sweetness meant for the guests standing nearby. "You actually made it." She did not offer a hug or even a handshake. Instead, she gestured vaguely toward the far, dark end of the sprawling ballroom. "We had a little mix-up with the event coordinators, but I made sure they found a spot for you two," she said smoothly, not breaking eye contact. The spot she had found for us was a tiny, wobbly table pressed right up against the swinging double doors of the service kitchen. Every time a harried waiter rushed out with trays of appetizers, the heavy wooden door brushed violently against Owen's chair. It was a banishment. It was a clear, undeniable geographical statement of exactly where I now stood in my father's life, out of sight, out of mind, and entirely disposable. I tried to swallow the heavy lump forming in my throat. I told myself I was here for my father, not to play Meredith's petty games, but then the overhead lights dimmed to a soft amber. The conversations hushed, and the commemorative slideshow began. A massive projector screen lowered slowly behind the head table. For 20 agonizing minutes, I sat in the shadows near the kitchen, watching my father's life flash across the screen in high definition. There were pictures of him at dusty job sites, wearing his hard hat, pictures of him holding up a fish at the lake, pictures of him smiling warmly at holiday dinners, and there were countless pictures of Meredith. There were endless, glamorous photos of Sloane. There was not a single image of my mother. There was not a single image of me. 33 years of my existence, wiped out by a cheerful digital transition effect and an upbeat country song. The erasure was so thorough, so aggressively deliberate, that I felt a sharp, physical ache in the center of my chest. It was as if I was watching my own funeral. Then, the microphone crackled sharply. Meredith stood at the wooden podium, basking in the spotlight. She spoke eloquently of my father's resilience, his endless hard work, and the beautiful, loving home they had built together. Then, with a practiced tear in her eye, she turned her gaze to Sloane, who was sitting gracefully at the head table, sipping expensive champagne. And to Sloane, Meredith cooed into the microphone, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the hall. Thank you for being the child who never left him, the one who stayed by his side through every single hardship, when others walked away. The applause that followed was deafening. It roared in my ears, mixing with the chaotic, rhythmic thud of my own heartbeat. The words were venomous. They were perfectly designed to paint me as the villain, the abandoning, ungrateful daughter, the one who had selfishly walked away from an aging man. I could not sit in the dark anymore. The silk of my mother's dress felt like heavy armor against my skin, urging me to move. I pushed my chair back, ignoring the cautious, warning glance from Owen, and began to walk across the massive room. The ballroom suddenly felt impossibly large. Every step I took toward the brightly lit head table drew a new set of eyes. Conversations stopped dead. The clinking of silverware against china faded into absolute silence. By the time I reached the front of the room, an oppressive, suffocating quiet had smothered Briar Glen Hall. There was an empty chair right beside my father, a chair that should have been mine by birthright and by love. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and placed my hand on the carved wooden back of that seat. I looked down at Douglas Griffin. I looked at the man who had taught me how to find the hidden structural flaws in houses, the man who had held my hand tightly at my mother's funeral, the man who had once been my entire world. Dad, I said. My voice was barely a whisper, yet it was loud enough to carry through the dead quiet of the room. He did not look at me with the warmth of a father. He did not even look at me with the confusion of an old man who had lost touch with his child. He looked at me with a profound, burning contempt that stripped the breath from my lungs. He stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped violently against the floorboards. His face was flushed crimson with anger. He pointed his finger directly at the chair my hand rested upon, staring right at me in front of nearly 90 shocked guests. That seat is for my real daughter, he snarled. Before I could even process the absolute cruelty of his words, he stepped forward. He raised his heavy, calloused hands, placed them firmly on my shoulders, and pushed me. It was not a gentle nudge to move me out of the way. It was a hard, aggressive shove fueled by years of manufactured resentment and twisted lies. My heels caught on the long hem of the dark blue dress, the silk twisted tightly around my legs, pulling my center of gravity down. I fell backward, crashing hard onto the polished hardwood floor. The impact shot a jolt of pain up my spine. As my hands flew out to catch myself, my wrist hit the floor, and my mother's fragile glass bracelet shattered loudly against the wood. Pieces of delicate glass exploded outward, scattering and glittering like crushed ice under the harsh chandelier light. A collective, horrified gasp sucked all the oxygen out of the room. I sat frozen on the floor, surrounded by the broken shards of my mother's memory, staring up at the man who had just publicly discarded me. My vision blurred instantly with tears of pure, burning humiliation. I expected someone to intervene. I expected my father to blink, to snap out of whatever hateful trance Meredith had put him in, to look down in horror and realize what he had just done to his own flesh and blood. Instead, he turned his back on me, and Sloane, wearing a perfectly rehearsed look of innocent concern, glided over from her spot and gracefully sat down in the empty chair. She claimed the seat as if she had been waiting in the wings for this exact, brutal choreography to play out. I was paralyzed. The heat of intense shame burned my cheeks. The whispers started at once from the surrounding tables, sharp and judgmental. I wanted the wooden floorboards to blur beneath me and let me disappear from the room entirely. I gathered the ripped silk of my skirt, ready to scramble to my feet, run out the double doors, and never look back. I was ready to surrender, ready to leave my father to the fake life he had chosen, ready to accept that I had been entirely replaced and erased. But then, a tall shadow fell over me, blocking out the glare of the spotlight. Owen Mercer stepped into the center of the disaster. My husband did not rush, and he did not panic. He moved with the terrifying, calculated precision of a man who had already won a war no one else in the room even knew they were fighting. He knelt down beside me on the polished wood. His large, warm hands gently grasped my arms, pulling me steadily to my feet. He carefully brushed a jagged shard of broken glass from the dark blue silk of my dress. He did not look at my father yet. He just looked at me. His dark eyes were incredibly steady and reassuring, offering a silent promise that I was not walking away from this humiliation and defeat. Then, Owen turned his body to face the head table. He did not clench his fists. He did not raise his voice to scream. He simply stood up perfectly straight, calmly adjusted the neat cuffs of his dark suit jacket, and reached slowly into his inner breast pocket. My husband had not come to this party to throw a punch. He had come to detonate a bomb. For 2.5 years, a massive, toxic lie had been meticulously grown, fed, and protected in the dark by Meredith and Sloane. Tonight, Owen was going to drag that lie kicking and screaming into the blinding light. The real battle for my father's soul, and for the absolute truth of my family, was about to begin. To understand how a man could push his only child to the floor, you have to look back at the foundation of the house before the rot set in, more than 10 years ago. My world was built on incredibly solid ground. My father was not a man of grand speeches, expensive suits, or country club memberships. Douglas Griffin was a master industrial electrician at Crescent Valley Transit Works. He spent his days deep in the concrete belly of the city infrastructure, wrestling with high-voltage lines, massive breaker panels, and unforgiving industrial machinery. He came home every evening smelling of ozone, copper wire, and honest sweat. He was a disciplined, unyielding man who firmly believed that love was something you proved with your calloused hands, not with empty words. Every Saturday morning, long before the sun even thought about rising, I would sit shivering in the passenger seat of his battered pickup truck. He took on small residential jobs on the weekends to save extra money for my future. I was his unofficial, undersized apprentice. Under his watchful eye, I learned how to strip wire, how to hold the heavy flashlight completely still, and most importantly, how to look past the surface of things. I remember standing in a dusty, half-finished basement when I was barely 12 years old. My father pointed to a pristine, freshly painted wall that looked perfect to my young eyes. "Look at that," he told me, his rough voice echoing in the empty room. "It looks beautiful, but whoever put up that drywall pinched the main electrical line right behind the stud. Give it 6 months, and the whole place goes up in smoke." Just because something looks pretty on the outside does not mean it is safe on the inside. It was a practical lesson about residential framing, but as I grew older, it became the exact lens through which I viewed the entire world. If my father was the heavy timber framing of our house, my mother, Rachel Griffin, was the light pouring through the windows. She was a gentle, brilliant woman with an endless patience for the rough edges of the world. She managed a small local library and spent her meager paycheck rescuing first-edition books from estate sales. Our living room was always filled with towering stacks of worn leather covers and the comforting scent of aging paper, dust, and vanilla. My mother did not care about keeping up appearances for the neighbors. She used to sit on our porch with a mug of hot tea and tell me that a lasting family is never built on what you can buy or how you look to outsiders. A family lasts because the people inside it are completely, undeniably real with each other. When I was 19 years old, the light in our house went out. The illness that took my mother was fast, aggressive, and entirely merciless. It swept through our lives like a violent winter storm, leaving behind a terrifying, hollow silence in the house. After she was gone, my father and I survived by leaning heavily against each other. We were like two exhausted survivors of a shipwreck clinging to the same piece of floating debris. The profound grief made us both incredibly quiet. We would spend entire Sunday afternoons sitting on the back patio, staring at the overgrown lawn, drinking black coffee, and not saying a single word. Some people might have looked at us and thought we were distant, cold, or broken, but in that heavy silence, There was an ironclad bond. I never once doubted that I was his entire world, the only piece of Rachel he had left. His emotional clumsiness was a known variable to me. He did not know how to talk about his feelings. He never bought greeting cards, and he rarely hugged me. But he always made sure my car had fresh oil. My tires were perfectly inflated, and the porch light was always turned on when I came home late. That was how Douglas Griffin loved. I grew up carrying both of their legacies in my hands. I took my father's sharp eye for structural integrity and my mother's quiet pragmatism, and I built a solid career out of them. I became a loss claims manager at Blue Haven Property Recovery. 5 days a week, sometimes working 50 or 60 hours. I walked into homes and businesses that had been devastated by fire, sudden floods, or sheer human negligence. My entire professional life revolved around tracking the tiny, hidden fractures that other people ignored until the roof eventually caved in. I was good at it. I understood disaster. But I was so focused on finding the physical cracks in the buildings around me that I completely missed the psychological hairline fractures forming in my own family. The shift did not happen overnight. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, about 4 years after my mother passed away. That was when my father met Meredith Harlow. Meredith was a widow who had recently moved into a wealthy subdivision across town. From the very first moment she stepped into our modest kitchen, she felt entirely out of place, yet desperately determined to take charge. She was polished to a terrifying degree. Her clothes were always tailored, her hair was perfectly styled regardless of the weather, and she moved with a practiced, gliding grace that demanded absolute attention. She possessed a sharp social intelligence. She knew exactly what to say, how long to hold eye contact, and how to make a tired, lonely widower feel like he was the most fascinating man on earth. She was incredibly smooth, so much so that her absolute need for control masqueraded beautifully as deep maternal care. When they went out to dinner, she would gently place her hand over his and order his meal for him, loudly claiming she knew what was best for his high blood pressure. She began adjusting his collar before he left for work, organizing his chaotic schedule, and slowly making daily decisions on his behalf. To the untrained eye, it looked like devotion. To my father, who was exhausted from carrying the weight of the world alone, it felt like relief. And then, there was Sloane. Meredith did not come into our lives alone. She brought her daughter. Sloane was 22 years old at the time, a few years younger than I was, and she was the exact opposite of everything I represented. Where I was quiet, practical, and independent, Sloane was a vibrant, exhausting explosion of needy energy. She was stunningly beautiful, constantly talking, and endlessly enthusiastic about the most trivial things. She possessed a unique talent for making herself the main character of any room she entered. More importantly, Sloane was remarkably unburdened. She did not carry the heavy, suffocating weight of mourning Rachel Griffin. For my father, who had spent years drowning in the quiet, dark waters of his own grief, Sloane was like a sudden burst of artificial sunlight. She was loud, she was demanding, and she forced him out of his shell. She would drag him into the living room to show him funny videos on her expensive phone, demand he help her put together cheap flat-pack furniture for her apartment, and fill the silent house with relentless, meaningless noise. Sloane made people feel that she was simply easier to love than someone who was still hurting. Loving me meant acknowledging the empty space my mother had left behind. Loving Sloane was an easy escape from reality. I watched this new dynamic unfold from the sidelines. I saw how deeply tired my father was after 30 years of breaking his back at the transit works. I saw the dark bags under his eyes and the thick silver gray creeping into his hair. When Meredith and Sloane officially moved into the house, I made a conscious, deliberate choice to step back. I accepted them into our lives, into the very spaces my mother used to occupy, because I truly believed my father deserved a second chance at happiness. I thought he had earned the right to come home to a house full of life, rather than a house echoing with ghosts. I convinced myself that there was enough room in his heart for all of us. I thought Meredith was just a companion for his twilight years, And Sloane was just an annoying but harmless step-sibling who needed a father figure. I wanted him to smile again, even if the people making him smile felt a little too shiny, a little too hollow. That was my fatal error. I mistook their presence for an addition to the family. I did not realize until it was entirely too late that they had not come to join us. They had come to replace me. By stepping back to give them space, I had inadvertently handed Meredith the pen. And quietly, methodically, behind a veil of polite smiles and fake concern, she began to rewrite the entire history of our family, line by line. She was preparing to erase me from the narrative entirely. Long before I even realized the book was being altered, Meredith did not steal my father in a single night. A sudden aggressive invasion would have triggered his defensive instincts, and he would have thrown her out. Instead, she operated like a slow, creeping dampness inside the walls of a sturdy house, silently rotting the timber over many months until the structure could no longer support its own weight. In the beginning, right after their small courthouse wedding, her performance was absolutely flawless. She was the picture of a mature, understanding woman stepping into a home that had known entirely too much sorrow. She used to walk through the hallway, trailing her manicured fingers over the wainscoting, and tell me how much she admired Rachel's eye for interior design. She was unfailingly polite to me, always making sure to ask about my day at the property recovery firm, maintaining a perfectly measured distance. She played the role of a gentle healer, someone who just wanted to mend a grieving house. But the geographical shift of our family began with the smallest, most insignificant objects. About 3 months after she officially moved her things into the master bedroom, I came over for a Sunday dinner and noticed the living room felt unusually cold. The knitted, dark green blanket my mother used to drape over the back of the reading chair was gone. A few weeks later, a silver picture frame containing a photograph of my parents at a lake house vanished from the stone mantelpiece. It was replaced by a sleek, modern vase filled with expensive, scentless white orchids. I tried to ask about it. I tried to keep my voice casual, asking where the picture had gone. Meredith was standing in the kitchen, wiping down the marble counter with a microfiber cloth. She stopped, looked at me with a soft, deeply pitying smile, and sighed. She told me she had carefully packed the photos away in acid-free archival boxes in the attic to protect them from sun damage. She placed a warm, heavy hand on my arm and said, in a voice dripping with synthetic sympathy, that keeping a house perfectly frozen in time was not healthy. She told me gently that I simply had not learned how to let go yet. She twisted my very normal desire to see my mother's face into a pathetic, selfish inability to move on. And because she sounded so incredibly reasonable, my father nodded along with her from the dining table. The environment shifted completely when Sloane moved in permanently. Her latest business venture, a boutique fitness clothing brand, had aggressively collapsed, leaving her with significant debts and no apartment. She took over the spare bedroom across from mine, almost overnight. The quiet, disciplined house of an industrial electrician transformed into a chaotic theatrical stage. Sloane brought in towering ring lights, racks of designer clothes, and an endless stream of loud, superficial friends. She began hosting catered networking dinners and filming luxury lifestyle videos in our modest backyard, using my father's hard-earned sanctuary as a prop for her imaginary success. I expected my father to lose his temper. I expected the man who demanded absolute quiet after 6 in the evening to kick the ring lights to the curb, but something entirely different happened. He was exhausted. He had spent 30 years wrestling with heavy machinery and coming home to a painfully quiet house. Now, he was suddenly the patriarch of a bustling, brightly lit home filled with beautiful people, loud music, and constant praise. Sloane would drape her arms around his neck, call him the best guy in the world, and hand him a glass of expensive bourbon. He became addicted to the noise. He became intoxicated by the feeling of being surrounded by vibrant life. Even if that life was entirely plastic, the real danger, however, arrived disguised as a medical emergency. Just over a year after the wedding, my father suffered a severe tear in his knee at a construction site. The injury required extensive reconstructive surgery. For the first time in his adult life, The toughest man I knew was completely immobilized. The doctor prescribed heavy, narcotic painkillers and ordered strict bed rest for nearly 8 weeks. This was the exact moment Meredith struck. While he was bedridden, hazy from the medication, and feeling deeply vulnerable, she systematically seized absolute control of the household infrastructure. It started with the schedule. If I called the house phone to speak with him, Meredith would answer on the first ring. She would whisper into the receiver, telling me he had just fallen asleep and she did not want to wake him. If I stopped by after work, she would intercept me at the front door, blocking the hallway with her body, claiming the physical therapist had said he needed absolute quiet. Then, she took the mail. The brass mailbox on the front porch became her exclusive territory. She sorted every envelope, tossing out what she deemed unimportant and keeping the rest in a locked leather binder. When I asked my father about a tax document, I usually helped him file. Meredith chimed in smoothly from the corner of the bedroom. She claimed she was just taking the administrative burden off his shoulders so he could focus entirely on his physical recovery and prepare for his upcoming retirement. The most terrifying shift was the digital takeover. My father and I had shared a household email account for years to manage the utility bills and property taxes. One Tuesday afternoon, I tried to log in to pay the water bill and found the password had been changed. When I confronted Meredith about it, she did not even blink. She told me there had been a suspicious login attempt from another state, so she updated the security settings and linked the account directly to her tablet for safety. She locked me out of my own family's communication network without breaking a sweat, all under the guise of digital security. While Meredith controlled the gates, Sloane played the perfect, ever-present servant. Because Sloane did not have a real job to go to, she was always there. She was the one handing him his tiny paper cup of pills exactly on the hour. She was the one driving his truck to pick up his special knee brace. She was the one aggressively signing for his medical packages at the front door. They created a perfectly choreographed illusion of absolute devotion. I felt the entire foundation of my family sliding off its axis. The house smelled different, sounded different, and operated under a completely foreign set of rules. But every single time I tried to sound the alarm, it backfired violently. When I finally pushed past Meredith in the hallway one afternoon and marched into his bedroom to tell him I felt pushed out, he did not listen. He was sitting in his recliner, his leg wrapped in thick bandages, his eyes slightly glazed from the heavy medication. He looked at me with raw, unfiltered irritation. He raised his voice, his rough tone echoing in the stifling room, and told me I was being ungrateful. He said Meredith was bathing him, feeding him, and managing a household while I only showed up to criticize the woman who was keeping him alive. I was standing right in front of him, but I had already lost him. By making herself the sole provider of his comfort, Meredith made any criticism of her feel like an attack on him. My father could not separate his physical dependence on her from the emotional manipulation she was executing. That vulnerable, heavily medicated recovery period was the exact incubator for the massive betrayal that followed. I did not realize it then, but she was not just keeping me out of his bedroom. She was building an impenetrable fortress around him by controlling who he spoke to, what documents he read, and which memories were allowed to stay on the mantelpiece. She was laying the invisible groundwork. She controlled the information. She controlled his physical environment. She was laying the foundation for a masterclass in theft. The control of his daily schedule and the control of his memory were merely the preparatory steps. The ultimate goal was the absolute control of his wealth, and she was preparing to use my own name and my own supposed selfishness as the very weapon to steal it. It happened on the third weekend of June, right over the Father's Day holiday. A massive, unpredictable storm system had swept through eastern Tennessee, ripping the roofs off commercial buildings and causing devastating flash floods across multiple counties. Blue Haven Property Recovery dispatched me across state lines on an emergency response team. I was standing knee-deep in freezing, murky water inside a ruined distribution center, hundreds of miles away from Kentucky. I was breathing in the foul, heavy stench of wet drywall and stagnant mud. working brutal 14-hour shifts to assess the structural damage. My phone battery was constantly dying, and cellular service was practically non-existent. I was completely consumed by the physical disaster directly in front of me, utterly unaware of the catastrophic demolition quietly occurring inside my own family. During those exact 48 hours, a sudden barrage of emails hit my father's inbox. They bore my exact first and last name. They utilized the same email signature I had used since graduating from college. But the words on the screen were incredibly vicious, meticulously calculated to hit every single one of his deepest insecurities. The messages coldly demanded that he put the family property on the market immediately to free up capital. They stated that holding on to the large house was a pathetic financial decision for an aging transit worker. The emails referred to Sloan as a freeloading parasite who was actively draining his hard-earned retirement funds. Worst of all, the final message insisted that I needed full financial power of attorney because his recent medical state clearly proved he was losing his mental grip on reality. Meredith did not just leave these horrific messages on a glowing screen for him to discover naturally. She weaponized them. She printed the forged emails out on crisp, bright white paper. She carried them into his bedroom on a polished wooden tray, placing them right next to his prescribed heavy dosage of narcotic pain medication. She waited for the precise window in the late afternoon when the drugs made him groggy, physically weak, and hyper-vulnerable to suggestion. Then, she sat on the edge of the mattress and read the printed lies out loud to him. She stroked his arm and wept completely fake tears. She whispered that she was so incredibly sorry, that it broke her heart to see my true, greedy colors, and that I was clearly preparing to strip him of his independence before he could even walk again. My father was a fiercely proud man who had never relied on anyone for his basic physical needs. Being bedridden, unable to even navigate the stairs to his own kitchen, already filled him with an intense, suffocating shame. Hearing that his only biological child viewed him as a pathetic, incompetent burden broke something fundamental inside his mind. He did not pick up the telephone to call me. He did not demand an in-person explanation to verify the wild accusations. The blinding physical agony in his joints mixed with a sudden, devastating emotional betrayal, and he reacted with pure, protective rage. He chose to believe the printed paper. He chose to believe he was a burden I wanted to liquidate. The moment my deployment in Tennessee finally ended, I drove 6 straight hours back to Louisville. My heavy work boots were still damp, and my clothes smelled faintly of floodwater. I pulled my muddy sedan into his driveway, carrying a small, carefully wrapped Father's Day gift box on the passenger seat. I walked up the concrete path, desperate to see him and apologize for missing the actual holiday, but I never made it across the threshold. Meredith was waiting for me on the front porch. She stood perfectly still, her posture rigid, physically blocking the heavy wooden front door. I asked to see him, my voice cracking from sheer exhaustion. She held her ground. She looked down at me from the elevated step with absolute, freezing triumph. She told me he had read my horrific messages about selling the house and seizing the money. She told me he was entirely disgusted by my ungrateful greed. I dropped my work bag onto the porch, my mind spinning in utter confusion. I pleaded with her, insisting I had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. I begged for just 5 minutes to speak with him face to face, just long enough to look him in the eye and clear up whatever terrible misunderstanding had happened. She stepped closer, lowering her voice into a dangerous, sharp hiss so the neighbors watering their lawns across the street would not hear. "He told me to tell you to leave," she whispered smoothly, her eyes locked onto mine. "And frankly, Kara, not everyone born to a father deserves to be called a daughter." She stepped backward and slammed the heavy oak door right in my face. The brass deadbolt clicked with a sickening, heavy, and final sound. I stood on the porch for a long time, completely bewildered, staring at the painted wood. The cold reality of the situation slowly washed over me. That was the absolute last time I stood on that property. What followed was a masterclass in total communication blackout. I tried calling his cell phone the next morning. It rang exactly one time and dropped immediately into a generic, automated voicemail. I sent dozens of frantic text messages, typing out massive paragraphs explaining that I was being framed and that my email must have been hacked. None of those messages ever delivered. I drafted long, desperate emails from my corporate work account, my personal account, and even created a brand new address just in case my main one had been blocked. They were all silently routed straight into a digital void. I wrote handwritten letters, pouring my heart out onto the lined paper, begging him to just meet me at a neutral coffee shop in town. I dropped them in the blue postal boxes, knowing now that Meredith intercepted every single envelope before he ever saw the mail carrier arrive at the curb. The true brilliance of Meredith's strategy was not the digital forgery itself. The forgery was merely the match that started the fire. The absolute genius was the impenetrable vacuum she created immediately afterward. From my father's perspective, he was trapped in a painful physical recovery, betrayed by the daughter who had aggressively demanded his money and then completely vanished when he refused to give it to her. He watched the front door for months, sitting in his recliner, waiting for an apology that never arrived. He truly thought I had abandoned him precisely when he needed me the most. From my perspective, I had been violently discarded without a trial or a jury. I thought the man who had taught me how to walk had actively chosen his shiny new family over me and could not even summon the courage to tell me to my face. I thought he had handed Meredith the keys to our shared history and given her explicit permission to lock me out forever. I eventually stopped calling. I stopped driving past the neighborhood. I surrendered to the narrative that I was no longer wanted. 2.5 years evaporated into that agonizing, silent void. We missed 3 of his birthdays. We missed 2 of mine. We went through 3 entire Christmases without a single card exchanged, 3 Thanksgivings without sharing a meal, and countless ordinary Sunday afternoons where the silence was so heavy it physically hurt my chest. It is a very specific type of grief to mourn someone who is still alive, living just 20 minutes across town. There were no heated arguments on the telephone. There were no dramatic ultimatums delivered in the living room. There was absolutely nothing to fight against, and therefore, there was nothing we could fix. We were just 2 people quietly bleeding out in separate lives, entirely convinced that the other person had willingly held the knife. Meredith won her massive victory without ever having to raise her voice in anger. She won by making a grieving father and a desperate daughter believe that the other had voluntarily walked away first. My husband, Owen Mercer, is not the kind of man who acts on raw impulse. He does not throw punches, he does not raise his voice in anger, and he never rushes into a confrontation without knowing exactly how it will end. He is a senior lead investigator at Vaultline Digital Forensics. His entire professional existence revolves around dissecting complex corporate fraud, unraveling high-stakes asset disputes, and tracking the invisible, digital footprints that people leave behind when they think no one is watching. He deals in metadata, hidden network addresses, offshore routing numbers, and encrypted financial ledgers. When a chief executive tries to hide illicit funds or manipulate a legal timeline, Owen is the man who quietly reconstructs the crime scene piece by piece. His mind operates like a steel trap. He does not fight with his fists. He fights with undeniable, documented proof. The first sign that the fortress around my father was beginning to crack came in the form of a heavy, cream-colored envelope. It was the formal invitation to the retirement gala. However, it was not sent to the home Owen and I had shared for the past 3 years. Instead, it was forwarded by the postal service from a tiny, run-down apartment I had rented briefly right after finishing college, nearly 8 years ago. To me, holding that thick cardstock felt like a sudden, miraculous olive branch from the heavens. I sat on my couch and wept, genuinely believing my father had finally bypassed his stubborn pride and reached out to me. But Owen did not see a father trying to make amends. He looked closely at the outdated address label and saw a massive, glaring operational error. He knew that if Meredith were truly in absolute, undisputed control of the guest list, she would never have allowed that invitation to see the light of day. Owen deduced that a third-party event coordinator had likely pulled a dusty, outdated mailing list directly from the transit union directory, inadvertently slipping past the heavily guarded gates of the Griffin household. It was not a gesture of peace. It was the very first slip in a meticulously maintained system of isolation. Just 2 days after the invitation arrived, a second anomaly occurred. My great-aunt Elaine Griffin, my father's older sister who lived in a neighboring county, sent me an urgent text message. It contained a blurry, poorly lit photograph of a piece of official mail. Due to a sorting error at the regional postal facility, the envelope had been routed to her mailbox instead of my father's. It was a formal, automated notice from a major national bank confirming the successful processing of a new mortgage loan recorded against the Griffin family property. I stared at the illuminated screen of my phone in absolute, utter disbelief. The information was completely illogical. My father had written the final check to pay off his 30-year mortgage over 5 years ago. He was a deeply conservative man regarding his finances. He absolutely hated owing a single dime to anyone, let alone putting the deed of his primary residence back into the hands of a bank on the very eve of his retirement. I tried to brush it off as a generic junk mail scam designed to trick the elderly, but Owen did not dismiss it. While I was sleeping soundly that night, he sat in the dark at his home office desk, fired up his secure terminal, and quietly accessed the county clerk's public property registry. What he discovered was not a marketing scam. It was a legally binding, fully executed home equity line of credit. It had been officially recorded against the Griffin property just 4 months prior. The total amount borrowed against the house was a staggering $215,000. Owen did not stop his investigation at the county records. He began cross-referencing public tax liens, state business registry filings, and open court dockets. Within 48 hours, he had completely mapped out exactly where that massive influx of cash had traveled. The withdrawal dates from the equity line aligned perfectly with the sudden, miraculous financial stabilization of a boutique fitness studio owned entirely by Sloan. Her business had been teetering on the absolute edge of total bankruptcy, facing 3 separate vendor lawsuits for unpaid invoices. Furthermore, Owen tracked a substantial portion of the borrowed funds directly to a massive, outstanding personal tax debt filed strictly under Sloan's Social Security number. My father's hard-earned home equity, the safety net he had built over 3 decades of manual labor, had been quietly drained to bail out my stepsister's disastrous financial choices. Owen knew he needed to prove exactly who had authorized that loan, because he strongly suspected my father had no idea he was suddenly over $200,000 in debt. Using a combination of perfectly legal open-source intelligence and a few specialized forensic tracing tools he utilized for tracking corporate espionage, he pulled the digital thread on the communications originating from my father's house. He managed to trace the underlying routing data of the cruel, unforgiving emails that had severed my relationship with my father 2.5 years ago. He discovered that a fraudulent account bearing my exact name had been created on the specific wireless network located inside the Griffin residence. The creation timestamp and the subsequent login history perfectly matched the specific weeks when my father was heavily sedated, confined to his bed, and recovering from his major knee surgery. The digital forensic dive went even deeper. By accessing cloud backups that were inexplicably still linked to an old, forgotten shared family cellular plan I used to manage, Owen found a terrifying cache of documents. These files were synced directly from a tablet device registered to Meredith. Within those hidden folders, he found high-resolution, perfectly lit photographs of my father's state driver's license. He found carefully cropped images of his wet ink signature taken from old tax returns. He found fully scanned, pristine copies of his Social Security card and his birth certificate. It was a complete, comprehensive digital forgery kit. It contained more than enough material to bypass standard bank security checks and execute almost any financial document without my father ever needing to be in the room. Owen carried this explosive, devastating burden in absolute silence for almost 3 weeks. He knew my heart was incredibly fragile regarding my family. I was spending every evening anxiously picking out the perfect dress, desperately hoping to just see my father smile at me again. Owen absolutely refused to crush that tiny, delicate spark of hope with a theory that was not yet fully proven. He waited patiently, working late into the night, until the chain of evidence was completely airtight. He compiled everything into a thick, heavily tabbed legal folder and locked it securely inside his breast pocket. When we finally walked out to our car to drive to Briar Glen Hall for the retirement party, Owen gripped the steering wheel with a quiet, terrifying resolve. He looked straight ahead at the dark road, carrying the horrifying truth that I was completely blind to. As I sat in the passenger seat, nervously smoothing the dark blue silk of my mother's dress, Owen knew this was never just about Meredith wanting me out of the family living room. It was a calculated, cold-blooded, long-term strategy to ensure I was completely and legally removed from every single piece of paperwork before my father officially received his massive transit union retirement payout. My husband was driving us directly into a trap, but he was the only one in the car who had brought the ammunition to destroy it. Walking into Briar Glen Hall felt less like attending a retirement celebration and more like stepping onto a meticulously curated movie set designed to mock my entire childhood. The sheer, suffocating luxury of the room was a violent contrast to the man being honored. My father was a man who spent 3 decades coming home with grease permanently embedded in his knuckles, a man who considered a cold beer on the back porch the ultimate luxury. Yet, the ballroom was draped in cascading white floral arrangements that cost more than his first truck. The tables were set with heavy gold chargers and crystal glasses. Every single detail bore the unmistakable, sterile aesthetic signature of Meredith. It was a sterile, wealthy fantasy that completely erased the humble, hard-working reality of the life he had built with my mother. During the initial cocktail hour, before we were officially banished to the tiny table by the swinging kitchen doors, we had to navigate the crowded floor. It was in those first 45 minutes that I realized how deeply the poison had been injected, and conversely, how much of my father's true history still survived in the minds of the people who actually knew him. We bumped into several of his old union buddies from the transit authority, a heavy-set foreman named Arthur, a man who used to come over for Sunday barbecues when I was 10 years old, grabbed my arm with a warm, calloused hand. He looked at me with genuine, unfiltered surprise. He loudly asked where I had been hiding for the last 2.5 years. He told me, with a nostalgic gleam in his eye, that my father used to pin my college report cards to the corkboard in the break room and brag about my job at the property recovery firm to anyone who would listen. Hearing Arthur say those words felt like a physical blow to my chest. It was definitive, undeniable proof that my father had never wanted to erase me. He had loved me fiercely and publicly for 30 years. The sudden, brutal silence of the last few years was not a natural decay of our relationship. It was an artificial blackout manufactured entirely by the woman currently smiling for the photographer by the ice sculpture. When we finally took our assigned seats at the very edge of the room, the suffocating social dynamics became even clearer. While I sat shivering in my mother's dark blue silk dress, consumed by anxiety, Owen sat perfectly still. He was not looking at the extravagant centerpieces or the expensive champagne. He was scanning the 90 guests with the cold, sharp precision of a forensic investigator surveying a crime scene. He was reading the room. He leaned in closely and whispered his observations into my ear. He pointed out the distinct micro-expressions of the crowd. He noted how my Aunt Elaine kept nervously twisting her napkin and refused to make eye contact with the head table. He pointed out the unnatural, rigid posture of Sloane's loud, wealthy friends, who kept glancing toward our dark corner as if they had been tipped off that a show was about to start. Owen realized immediately that half the room was uncomfortable because they sensed something was fundamentally wrong, and the other half was silently complicit, waiting for the execution. Then, the lights dimmed, and the grand illusion was projected onto the massive screen. Watching the 30-year photographic retrospective of my father's life, I finally understood the absolute ruthlessness of Meredith's campaign. It was not just that my mother and I were missing from the slideshow, it was the deliberate replacement of our history. Where there should have been photos of my father teaching me to ride a bicycle, there were polished, professional portraits of him standing next to Sloane at a luxury resort. where there should have been images of him holding my mother's hand. There were heavily filtered videos of Meredith kissing his cheek at a charity gala. It was a complete, hostile takeover of a man's legacy, broadcast in high definition. When Meredith finally took the stage, her speech was a masterclass in psychological framing. She did not just praise my father, she proactively built a defensive wall around her own lies. By introducing Sloane to the crowd as the child who was always there, the one who was the most patient, the most loyal, and the one who stayed when he was at his absolute weakest, she was painting a very specific picture. She was ensuring that if I dared to speak up, if I dared to cause a scene, I would instantly be viewed by the audience as the erratic, jealous, and absentee daughter trying to ruin a beautiful evening. She set the narrative trap perfectly before I could even defend myself. From my isolated vantage point near the kitchen, I saw the ultimate bait. There was a single, glaringly empty chair positioned right next to my father at the head table. Earlier, I had thought it was a careless logistical oversight. Now, staring at the perfectly placed silver cutlery and the folded linen napkin, I understood the terrifying brilliance of the trap. It was not an accident. Meredith had left that seat empty intentionally. It was close enough to serve as a beacon, silently daring me to step forward and claim my rightful place in the family. Yet, it was located in the most illuminated, heavily scrutinized center of the room. If I stayed in the shadows, I accepted my permanent exile. If I walked forward to take it, I walked directly onto the scaffold she had built for my public humiliation. I chose to walk forward. I had to know, once and for all, if the man sitting there was merely a captive of her manipulation, or if he had truly become a willing participant in my destruction. When I placed my hand on the back of that empty chair, the final, agonizing answer was delivered. My father, standing up and snarling that the seat was reserved for his real daughter, was the verbal blade that severed the last remaining thread between us. But the physical push that followed was the absolute end of my childhood. When his heavy hands shoved my shoulders, sending me crashing down onto the polished hardwood, he did not just knock me off my feet, he demolished the very core of who I thought he was. The man who had spent his life teaching me how to spot structural failures had just intentionally collapsed the roof of his own house directly onto my head. As I lay there, feeling the sharp sting of the shattered glass from my mother's bracelet cutting into my skin, the cruelty escalated. Sloane did not gasp. She did not look horrified. She moved with the predatory grace of an understudy who had just been handed the leading role. She smoothly slid into the empty chair, leaning over to grip my father's arm tightly. She looked down at me with a perfectly manufactured expression of fear and concern, brilliantly playing the role of the loyal daughter protecting her fragile father from the dangerous, unhinged intruder bleeding on the floor. For several agonizing seconds, the massive ballroom was dead silent. Nearly 100 people held their breath. No one rushed forward with a napkin. No one yelled for my father to calm down. They were paralyzed by the sheer, naked cruelty of the spectacle. They all chose the safety of silence, allowing Meredith's carefully written script to play out flawlessly to its devastating conclusion. But Meredith had made one fatal miscalculation in her grand theatrical production. She had completely underestimated the man sitting in the shadows by the kitchen doors. Owen Mercer stepped into the blinding light of the head table. The suffocating silence of the room did not intimidate him. It gave him the perfect acoustic environment for what he was about to do. He did not come to argue with my father. He did not come to beg for my dignity. He came to present the cold, undeniable ledger of their crimes. As he stood up straight and reached into his jacket pocket, the era of Meredith Harlow's absolute control ended, and the total dismantling of her empire began. Owen's grip on my arm was firm but remarkably gentle. He did not rush the movement. He pulled me upward with steady strength, ensuring my footing was completely stable before he released his hold. He bent down slightly and brushed a microscopic speck of dust from the dark blue silk of my dress. He performed this small, intimate gesture with deliberate slowness, forcing the entire room to wait in agonizing suspense. He did not yell at the man who had just assaulted his wife. Instead, he turned to face the head table with an expression of polite curiosity that was far more terrifying than any scream could ever be. "Douglas," Owen began, his voice perfectly modulated, carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. He did not address the physical violence. He completely ignored the shattered glass scattered across the floorboards. He aimed directly at the structural integrity of the man's absolute pride. "Since exactly when did you decide to borrow over $200,000 against the equity of your home?" The question hung heavily in the chilled air of the banquet hall. My father froze. His chest, which had been heaving with manufactured anger just a second prior, stopped moving entirely. He stared at Owen, his brow furrowing in deep, genuine confusion. The raw fury in his eyes flickered, instantly replaced by the absolute certainty of a man who managed his finances with an iron grip. "I do not owe a single dime to anyone," my father replied, his voice rough but highly defensive. "I paid that house off entirely over 5 years ago. You are out of your mind." Meredith did not let a single heartbeat pass before she launched her frantic counterattack. She practically leaped out of her chair, the expensive fabric of her emerald gown catching the harsh chandelier light. "Security needs to be called right now," she announced loudly to the crowd, her voice pitching up into a theatrical tone of deep distress. "This man is clearly trying to ruin a beautiful evening with insane accusations. They are just trying to cause a scene because they are bitter and broke." Owen did not even grant her a passing glance. He maintained unbroken, surgical eye contact with my father. Reaching into the inner breast pocket of his dark suit jacket, he withdrew the thick, folded packet of papers he had meticulously compiled over the last few weeks. He stepped forward and placed a heavy, stapled document directly onto the center of the white linen tablecloth, right next to Sloane's untouched crystal champagne glass. The heavy paper landed with a dull, authoritative thud. "That is a certified copy of a home equity line of credit," Owen stated calmly, his tone conversational, yet entirely clinical. "It was officially recorded by the county clerk exactly 4 months ago. The principal amount is $215,000, and it bears your exact digital signature. Douglas." My father looked down at the stark white paper illuminated by the table spotlight. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at the document as if it were a venomous snake coiled directly next to his dinner plate. "I never signed anything," my father muttered, but the absolute, booming conviction from his previous statement was gone, replaced by a slight, terrifying tremor of doubt. Owen tilted his head slightly, stepping naturally into the relentless rhythm of a seasoned forensic interrogator. "Think back to the second week of February. You were heavily medicated following your extensive knee reconstruction. Do you recall an online notary appointment? A brief video call on a tablet device where you were asked to digitally authorize some urgent paperwork?" I watched the color slowly drain from my father's weathered face. I could almost see the rusted gears of his memory violently grinding together, desperately trying to pierce through the heavy fog of the powerful narcotics he had been prescribed during that specific recovery period. "Those were insurance authorization forms," my father said slowly, his voice dropping an entire octave. He finally looked away from Owen and turned his head toward his wife. "Meredith told me the hospital required supplementary digital signatures for the outpatient physical therapy coverage." Meredith's face was a mask of rigid, desperate composure. "They were standard insurance forms," she snapped, though the artificial sweetness had completely vanished from her tone, leaving only sharp panic. "He is fabricating these documents. Anyone can print a fake property deed off the internet." Owen remained completely unbothered by her rising hysteria. "I am sure the county prosecutor will find that specific defense absolutely fascinating," he replied smoothly. He reached out and tapped a specific paragraph highlighted on the top page of the document. "Because the disbursement ledger attached to this loan is quite clear. Less than 48 hours after that brief notary call, $180,000 was wired directly from that new credit line into the primary operating account of a commercial business named Halo House Studio." The mention of the studio name acted like a gunshot in the quiet room. Sloane, who had been sitting triumphantly in the stolen chair just moments ago, suddenly recoiled. Her perfectly glossed lips parted in sheer shock. That business was facing 3 separate vendor lawsuits and imminent bankruptcy filings. Owen continued, delivering the financial facts with the rhythmic, unavoidable precision of a ticking clock. The sudden influx of cash from your home equity miraculously settled those debts entirely out of court. The remaining $35,000 was subsequently routed to pay off a massive personal state tax lien filed exclusively under Sloane's Social Security number. Sloane panicked completely. Her polished, sophisticated veneer shattered under the intense, suffocating pressure of the public exposure. She stood up abruptly, pointing a manicured finger directly at me across the table. "You are just jealous!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the high architectural ceiling. "You have not been around for almost 3 years, and now you show up with your husband just to try and steal his retirement money. You are pathetic!" It was the absolute worst tactical move she could have made. It was too fast, too highly defensive, and entirely devoid of any actual denial regarding the severe financial facts Owen had just presented to the room. The atmosphere among the 90 guests shifted violently. The transit workers, men who had spent decades guarding their own modest pensions and deeply understood the sacred value of a fully paid-off mortgage, began to murmur darkly. Arthur, the heavy-set foreman who had greeted me warmly earlier in the evening, crossed his massive arms over his chest and glared intensely at the head table. The crowd was no longer looking at me as the ungrateful daughter trying to ruin a retirement party. They were actively looking at Meredith and Sloane as grifters who had just been caught red-handed in a massive financial scheme. Then, the final, devastating nail in the coffin was driven in by someone entirely unexpected. From a round table near the center of the room, my great-aunt Elaine pushed her chair back. The harsh scraping sound of the wood against the polished floor was deafening. She was a small, fiercely proud woman in her late 70s, and she absolutely did not tolerate fools. She stood up perfectly straight, clutching her beaded evening bag with both hands, and looked directly past the floral centerpieces at her younger brother. "Douglas," Elaine said, her voice shaking with years of heavily suppressed frustration, "during those 2 months you were laid up in that bed, I drove over to your house 6 different times. 6 separate times. I brought warm food. I brought the newspaper crossword puzzles you always liked. And every single time, your wife met me out on the front porch and told me you were either deeply asleep or in entirely too much pain to see anyone." Meredith gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning pure white under the strain. "Elaine, please, this is absolutely not the time." "Do not interrupt me," Elaine snapped back with absolute, freezing authority. She turned her attention immediately back to my father. "She told me you specifically did not want visitors. She told the guys from the Union Hall the exact same story. We all thought you were just being a stubborn old mule about your injury. But she never let a single one of your own blood relatives step foot inside your bedroom while you were on those heavy pills. Not once." The invisible, impenetrable walls of the fortress Meredith had built around my father were collapsing right in front of his eyes. I watched his gaze dart rapidly from the stark legal document resting on the table, to Sloane's panicked and highly guilty face, to his older sister standing defiantly in the crowd, and finally to the polished woman he had married. For the very first time that entire evening, my father did not look at me with burning contempt. He did not look at me as the hostile, greedy intruder who had callously abandoned him. As the heavy, horrifying realization of his actual circumstances settled over him, his rigid posture completely changed. The aggressive, defensive tension leaked entirely out of his broad shoulders. He looked at Meredith, not as his devoted, loving caretaker, but as a highly dangerous stranger who suddenly possessed entirely too much unauthorized power over his life, his money, and his reality. Owen did not give anyone a single chance to recover. The total demolition of a lie this massive required an absolute, uninterrupted bombardment of the truth. He reached back into his breast pocket and produced a second, much thicker manila envelope. The crisp sound of the paper tearing open echoed sharply in the cavernous ballroom, cutting through the heavy tension. He pulled out a stack of dense, technical printouts and fanned them across the white linen tablecloth, right next to the mortgage documents. He looked directly at my father, his dark eyes entirely devoid of sympathy for the perpetrators. "You firmly believed Kara sent you those horrific messages demanding your money," Owen said, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. But digital communication always leaves a permanent, undeniable footprint. This document is the raw network metadata from that specific email address. It details exactly where and when the account was registered. It was not created in Tennessee, where my wife was working a disaster recovery zone. It was created on the designated wireless internet router installed in your very own living room. My father stared blankly at the columns of black text. The realization that the weapon used to sever his relationship with his only child was forged right down the hall from his own bedroom was visibly suffocating him. He looked like a man who had just been struck by a high-speed train but was still trying to understand how he ended up on the tracks. Owen laid down another sheet of paper. "And this is the internal synchronization history from your shared family cellular plan. It proves exactly why Kara never received a reply to her hundreds of desperate text messages, and why you never saw a single one of them. Every single message my wife sent to your phone number was automatically routed and marked as read on an external tablet device. Specifically, an iPad registered directly under Meredith's name." Meredith slammed both of her hands flat onto the table, rattling the expensive silver cutlery. "He is a hacker!" she screamed, entirely abandoning her pretense of high society elegance. Her face was flushed a dark, angry red with absolute panic. "He breaks into computer systems for a living. He fabricated every single line of that data to frame me because they are desperate for the retirement money." Owen did not raise his voice. He simply flipped over the next glossy page. "I do not need to fabricate anything when your daughter enthusiastically documents her own crimes for the general public. This is a screenshot of the digital mail filter secretly created on your household network. It was explicitly programmed to automatically delete any incoming email containing Kara's address before it could ever hit your main inbox. Look very closely at the exact timestamp. It was created at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon on a Tuesday." Owen then produced a bright, color-printed photograph. "And this is a social media post Sloan published at exactly 2:15 on that identical Tuesday. The caption proudly reads, 'Staying home to take care of Dad.' And in the reflective background of the television screen in that specific photo, you can clearly see Meredith sitting at the kitchen island, typing on the exact iPad that instituted the communication blackout." Meredith's jaw clamped shut. She had absolutely nowhere left to maneuver in the digital realm. So Owen flawlessly pivoted his attack to the physical one. He laid down a stark, perfectly itemized receipt printed on heavy cardstock. It bore the elegant logo of a high-end vintage consignment boutique located on the wealthy side of the city. "Douglas, you told Kara last year that Rachel's jewelry was safely locked away in a climate-controlled storage unit for preservation," Owen stated, his tone dropping into something far more somber and dangerous. "It is not 2 years ago, less than 30 days after you locked your daughter out of your house, an entire collection of antique gold necklaces, vintage brooches, and diamond earrings was quietly liquidated for cash at this boutique. The seller listed on this sworn intake form is Meredith Harlow." A sharp, physical pain shot completely through my chest. The fragile glass bracelet that had just shattered on the floor was one of the very last pieces I actually possessed. The rest of my mother's physical legacy had been secretly pawned to fund the luxury lifestyle of a woman who completely hated her memory. My father let out a low, agonizing sound, a wounded noise that seemed to be torn directly from his throat. He looked at Meredith with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. But Owen was far from finished. He had saved the absolute most dangerous piece of financial evidence for the grand finale. He pulled out a final, single sheet of paper. It was a printed draft of a human resources authorization form bearing the official crest of Crescent Valley Transit Works. I spoke with the administrative department at the Union Hall this morning, Owen announced to the silent room. They confirmed that they recently received a digital request to completely reroute your upcoming lump sum retirement bonus. The request asked to bypass your standard checking account entirely and deposit the massive payout into a newly established private trust. Before my father could even utter a single word of denial, a woman sitting 3 tables away stood up. It was Brenda, the senior payroll administrator who had worked at the Transit Authority for nearly 25 years. She clutched her cloth napkin nervously but spoke with absolute, unwavering conviction. "It is true. Douglas," Brenda called out, her voice trembling slightly under the intense weight of the room's collective attention. "We got the portal notification last Wednesday. But you have always come down to my office to fill out your tax forms with a blue pen. You barely even know how to log into the online employee portal. When I saw the routing request to a trust fund, I flagged it for manual review because it just did not look like something you would ever do." Owen nodded respectfully toward Brenda before turning the paper around so my father could read the beneficiary line. "The controlling trustee of that new financial entity is Meredith. If you had gone into the office next week and signed the final stack of exit papers she undoubtedly prepared for you, your entire life savings would have legally vanished into an account you could not access." My father looked completely hollowed out. The man who had spent his entire life building a solid foundation realized he was standing on absolute thin air. Owen turned his cold, surgical gaze entirely onto Sloane. "And the worst part is not even the retirement theft. It is the liability. Sloane did not just use your home equity to secretly bail out her failed fitness studio. Over the last 14 months, she has utilized the physical address of your property as the primary guarantor for 4 separate high-interest personal credit lines. If she defaults on her lavish spending habits, the creditors will not go after her empty bank accounts. They will immediately put a massive lien on your family home." The sheer velocity of the evidence was entirely too much for a house built on lies to withstand. The pressure inside the ballroom had reached a critical, explosive threshold. Sloane, who had lived her entire adult life running away from the consequences of her actions, finally cracked. She backed away from the head table, her hands raised defensively, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly into her face. She looked at her mother, her eyes wide with frantic, selfish terror. "I told you this was a bad idea," Sloane shrieked, her voice breaking violently into a loud, ugly sob. She pointed directly at Meredith, throwing the woman who had orchestrated everything entirely under the bus just to save her own skin. "I knew about the fake emails. I knew about the loan. But you told me it was just to secure our future. You told me it would just be a temporary loan until my business took off. I never thought you were going to take his whole pension. I never thought it would go this far." Meredith lunged forward, grabbing Sloane violently by the arm, hissing furiously for her to shut her mouth, but it was far too late. The confession had already echoed off the crystal chandeliers and burned itself permanently into the minds of every single person present. A profound, heavy realization settled over the entire 90 guests inside Briar Glen Hall. The initial shock of my public humiliation had entirely vanished. The transit workers, the old family friends, and the estranged relatives no longer viewed this as a tragic, messy family feud between a stubborn father and an estranged daughter. The absolute truth was standing completely naked in the center of the room. This had never been a simple misunderstanding. It was a highly calculated, ruthlessly executed campaign to systematically isolate a grieving daughter, seize absolute psychological control over an aging man, and liquidate every single asset he had ever worked for just days before he was officially supposed to rest. Owen had not just ruined a retirement party, he had successfully stopped a massive robbery in plain daylight. My father stared at the mountain of printed evidence scattered across the white linen tablecloth. The deep, violent flush of righteous anger that had painted his face just minutes ago completely vanished. It was entirely replaced by an ashen, hollow gray. He no longer looked like the furious, unyielding patriarch defending his honorable territory. He looked exactly like a man who had suddenly woken up in the middle of a freezing, dense forest. Finally realizing he had been intentionally led completely off the map by the very person holding the only flashlight. His large, calloused hands hung limply at his sides, completely stripped of their fighting strength. Meredith realized instantly that the digital and financial paper trails had trapped her in a corner with absolutely no way out. The glossy, high society mask she had meticulously maintained for years finally shattered into irreparable pieces. Her elegant, perfectly rehearsed posture collapsed. Realizing she could no longer deny the cold, hard facts laid out by my husband, she resorted to a frantic, half-hearted confession meant to sound like a desperate plea for sympathy. "I had to do something," Meredith pleaded, her voice cracking as she tried to manipulate the horrified crowd watching her every move. "I had to protect Sloane's future. You were getting older. Douglas, you were constantly looking at those old photographs of Rachel, always retreating into the past when you thought no one was watching. I was absolutely terrified that once you officially retired and had nothing but free time in that house, you would just sink back into your grief. I was terrified you would wake up one morning, decide you did not need us anymore, and throw us out onto the street. I was just trying to secure our permanent place in this family." My father slowly lifted his gaze from the table. The sheer, unfathomable betrayal in his eyes was absolute. He looked at the woman he had married, the woman who had claimed to be his savior during his darkest physical recovery. "You decided to protect your child by burying mine alive?" he asked. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, devastating whisper, heavy with the terrifying weight of his own blindness. Yet, that quiet question carried 1,000 times more power than any enraged scream. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Even the catering staff standing by the kitchen doors had stopped moving entirely. I stood perfectly still next to Owen. The bottom hem of my mother's dark blue silk dress was violently torn from the fall, the delicate, expensive fabric hanging unevenly against my bruised legs. But I did not shrink away into the shadows. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer any dramatic, emotional pleas for his affection or validation. I simply looked at him with the cold, immovable reality of a woman who had survived entirely without a father for nearly 3 years. That absolute calmness, the total absence of the desperate, begging daughter he expected to see, seemed to hurt him far more deeply than if I had screamed curses at him across the room. He took a shaky, uncertain step toward me. His heavy hands trembled visibly as he reached out in the space between us. "I am so sorry," he choked out, his rough voice breaking under the crushing weight of his monumental, life-altering failure. "Kara, I did not know. I swear to God, I did not know she was doing this." I immediately raised my hand, stopping him exactly where he stood. "No," I said, my voice steady, precise, and completely devoid of warmth. "Do not do that." A panicked apology born entirely out of public humiliation does not magically erase 2.5 years of silence. You spent nearly 1,000 days firmly believing I was a greedy, heartless monster. You chose to believe a printed piece of paper over 30 years of raising me in your own home. You never drove to my house to demand the truth. You never looked me in the eye. You just chose to throw me away because it was easier than fighting for me. A single apology right now does not fix the absolute fact that you let another woman completely overwrite your reality. He flinched violently, stepping back as if I had physically struck him across the face. The pain in his expression was profound. He thought the absolute worst of the nightmare had already been laid bare on the banquet table. He thought the total financial ruin and the stolen home equity were the bottom of the abyss. But Owen Mercer was not quite finished. My husband reached into his tailored jacket one final time and pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of thick legal paper. He did not toss it aggressively. He placed it down on the table with the grim, clinical solemnity of a coroner pulling a sheet over a body. "If you truly think this was just about draining your bank accounts, Douglas, you are still entirely underestimating your wife," Owen stated quietly, ensuring his voice carried to the back rows of the silent hall. "This is a drafted petition for legal conservatorship. It was prepared by a private family attorney hired by Meredith exactly 3 weeks ago. It was officially scheduled to be filed in the county court exactly 5 days after your retirement date. My father looked down at the crisp, terrifying document. He could barely comprehend the legal terminology printed on the page. A conservatorship? He repeated blindly, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Yes, Owen confirmed, his tone entirely factual and unrelenting. The petition heavily cites your recent knee surgery, the heavy narcotic medications you were prescribed during your recovery, and falsely claims you have been suffering from severe, undocumented cognitive decline. The legal argument presented here is that you are no longer mentally fit to manage your own estate, your own medical decisions, or your own finances. Once your union pension was safely routed into her private trust next week, this document would have legally stripped you of your absolute autonomy. Owen tapped the signature line of the unfiled document. You would have become a prisoner in your own home, entirely dependent on Meredith's legal permission to spend a single dollar, sell your own property, or even make a single phone call. She was not just stealing your retirement fund, she was stealing your fundamental right to be a free adult. The blood completely drained from my father's weathered face. The ultimate horrifying endgame was finally laid out under the bright chandelier light. He was not just losing his hard-earned savings. Meredith had meticulously planned to turn him into a legally incapacitated hostage the very second his manual labor was no longer profitable to her. Desperation makes cornered people incredibly dangerous, and Meredith was drowning in the wreckage of her own ambition. With her entire master plan completely exposed to 90 horrified witnesses, she desperately lunged for the absolute only weapon she had left in her arsenal. She pointed her finger furiously across the table directly at me, her face contorted in pure, venomous hatred. "Do not listen to them!" she shrieked at my father, her voice turning shrill and echoing wildly off the high ceilings. "Look at her! She did not care about you for almost 3 years. She only came back tonight because she smelled the money. She only showed up because she realized there was a massive retirement check left to steal. She does not love you. She is just a bitter, jealous girl who came here to ruin everything I built for this family." I opened my mouth to respond to her pathetic, vile accusation. I wanted to tell her that I would gladly burn every single dollar he had if it meant I could have my mother back. But before I could speak a single word, Owen placed a warm, heavy hand on the lower center of my back, gently and firmly silencing me. He stepped slightly in front of me, acting as an impenetrable, calm shield against her frantic screaming. "My wife did not come here for a single cent of your stolen money," Owen said, his voice dropping into a dark, absolute zero temperature that froze the rest of Meredith's words completely in her throat. "And before you dare to accuse her of abandoning her father again, there is exactly one last piece of evidence everyone in this room needs to hear. Because the biggest, most destructive lie told in this building tonight was not written on a bank document." Owen reached into his dark trouser pocket and pulled out a small, rectangular wireless speaker. He set it deliberately down on the white linen tablecloth. Right next to the drafted conservatorship papers, the final, devastating hammer was about to fall, and it was not going to strike a financial ledger or a forged signature. It was going to strike the very core of the emotional manipulation that had started this entire war. Owen pressed a single button on his smartphone, pairing it instantly with the small black speaker resting on the white linen tablecloth. He did not offer any dramatic preamble. He simply let the digital ghost of my father's true intentions speak for itself. A sharp hiss of static filled the cavernous ballroom, followed by the heavy, labored breathing of a man fighting through intense physical pain. Then, my father's voice echoed out of the speaker. It was remarkably weak, deeply raspy from the intubation tube used during his knee surgery, and laced with a profound, aching vulnerability that I had not heard since the day my mother died. "Kara," the recorded voice croaked, pausing to take another ragged breath. "It is Dad. The hospital bed is terrible, and the pills are making my head spin. I just wanted to hear your voice. I am sorry things have been so hard lately. I miss you. Kid, please come home when you get off work. I just want my daughter." A short, electronic beep signaled the end of the recording. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. It was heavier than any shout, more devastating than any financial ledger. I stood perfectly still, my hands trembling uncontrollably at my sides. For 2.5 agonizing years, I had built a protective armor around my heart, firmly believing that my father had actively chosen to throw me away. I thought he had looked at the life Meredith offered and decided I was completely expendable. Hearing that voicemail, hearing the raw, desperate love in his hoarse voice, shattered that armor into a million jagged pieces. He had wanted me. He had called out for me in the dark. I recovered that audio file from a buried, deleted folder in the local backup drive of your home computer, Owen explained, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a scalpel. He looked directly at my father, who was staring at the speaker with wide, entirely unblinking eyes. That voicemail never reached my wife. It was intercepted, listened to, and manually deleted from the outgoing server. Owen turned his cold, unforgiving gaze toward Meredith, who was shrinking back against her chair, her face completely drained of blood. "And here is the absolute most damning part of the timeline," Owen continued, raising his voice so the 90 guests in the room could hear every single syllable. Exactly 3 hours and 42 minutes after Douglas recorded that heartfelt plea for his daughter to come home, the fraudulent email account bearing Kara's name was registered on your network. Less than 4 hours after he asked for her, the violent, abusive messages demanding his money were typed up and printed out. The operation to completely erase Kara Griffin from her father's life was not a random occurrence. It was explicitly launched as a direct, panicked response to that exact voicemail. Meredith realized Douglas still loved his daughter, so she immediately built a cage of lies to make sure they would never speak again. My father looked as though he had just been physically gutted. He slumped forward, gripping the edge of the banquet table so hard the heavy wood groaned. He turned his head slowly to look at Meredith. He did not look at her with anger. He looked at her as if he were staring at a terrifying, unrecognizable monster that had been sleeping right beside him for years. He was looking at a house collapsing directly onto its own foundation. Every single thing he had believed to be true, every comforting lie she had fed him while he was vulnerable, disintegrated into ash. He pushed himself up from the table. He did not yell at her. He simply reached out and grabbed the wireless microphone that Meredith had used earlier to spin her beautiful, fictitious web of lies. He stood up tall, his broad shoulders squaring as the proud, unyielding industrial electrician finally returned to the surface. He looked out at the sea of shocked faces, his union brothers, his sister, his old neighbors. "Kara Griffin is my daughter," my father declared into the microphone, his rough voice booming through the hall with absolute, undeniable authority. "She is the only child of Rachel Griffin, and she is the absolute only person sitting at this table who has not spent the last 3 years lying to my face just to steal my life savings." He dropped the microphone onto the table. It landed with a loud, heavy thud. He turned his massive frame toward Meredith and Sloane. "Get out," he commanded, his tone dropping into a dangerous, freezing register. "Get your purses and walk out of those double doors right now. Do not go back to my house. Do not touch a single thing inside it. If either of you are standing on my property when I get home tonight, I am calling the county sheriff to have you both arrested for trespassing." Meredith opened her mouth, desperately searching for one final, manipulative string to pull, but there was absolutely nothing left. The crowd of transit workers and family friends was glaring at her with open, undisguised disgust. Sloane was already sobbing, grabbing her expensive designer clutch and practically running toward the coat check. Meredith stood up, her emerald gown suddenly looking like a ridiculous costume, and followed her daughter out of the ballroom in total, humiliating defeat. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind them, sealing their exile. My father took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked over at the table where Arthur and his union brothers were sitting. "Arthur," he called out, "I need you to get the union legal representative on the phone first thing tomorrow morning. We are freezing every single piece of retirement paperwork. I am shutting down all bank transfers. And we are going to start pulling the property deeds. Nobody gets a single dime." Then, he finally turned fully toward me. The entire room watched, expecting the grand cinematic resolution. They expected me to run into his arms, to cry onto his shoulder, to let the magic of the revealed truth instantly wash away the years of deep, festering wounds, but I did not move. I stood my ground, my posture straight despite the torn silk of my mother's dress hanging around my ankles. He took a hesitant step toward me, his eyes filled with profound, begging sorrow. "Kara," he whispered, entirely stripped of his pride. "Do not," I said, my voice steady and completely clear. I looked him directly in the eye, setting the absolute hardest boundary of my life. "I am glad you finally see the truth. I am incredibly grateful to my husband for fighting a battle you should have fought yourself. But this is not a fairy tale, and this does not magically fix us. You let another woman lock me out of my childhood home. You believed a printed piece of paper over the daughter you raised for 30 years. You have to live with the fact that you allowed her to pawn my mother's jewelry to buy designer clothes." He swallowed hard, bowing his head in complete shame. "I am not walking away from you," I told him, making sure he heard the firm promise in my words. "But I am not giving you a free pass, either. This right here is ground zero. This is the absolute bottom. If you want to be my father again, you are going to have to do the heavy lifting to rebuild the foundation you let her destroy." The aftermath of that explosive night was swift and incredibly brutal. The following morning, my father's union lawyers descended upon the fraudulent paperwork like a pack of wolves. The massive home equity loan was immediately frozen and heavily disputed through the county fraud division. Meredith was served with multiple civil lawsuits regarding the stolen funds and the unauthorized sale of my mother's vintage jewelry, while simultaneously facing an active criminal investigation for the forged digital signatures. Sloan, entirely cut off from the Griffin family safety net, was left to face her aggressive creditors and her impending bankruptcy absolutely alone. They had tried to steal a man's entire legacy, and instead, they walked away with absolutely nothing but legal ruin. 4 weeks later, the heavy summer heat had finally broken into a crisp autumn afternoon. I was sitting at the small wooden table in my own kitchen when I heard the familiar, heavy rumble of his old pickup truck pulling into my driveway. I opened the front door. My father stood on the porch holding a worn cardboard box. Inside the box were the acid-free archival albums filled with photographs of my mother. Resting on top of the albums was a small digital flash drive containing the recovered voicemail and a heavy brass key to the front door of my childhood home. He did not ask for a hug. He did not ask for immediate forgiveness. He just held the box out to me, his calloused hands remarkably steady. I took the box from him. I stepped back, opening the door a little wider. I looked at the man who was finally, slowly learning how to look past the surface of things again. I invited him inside to sit at my kitchen table for a cup of black coffee. We did not talk about the money, or the lawsuits, or the terrible silence of the last 2.5 years. We just sat together in the quiet afternoon light. The wounds were still incredibly deep, and the road to repairing our family would take years to navigate. But as I set the brass key down on the table, I knew we were finally moving in the right direction, simply because the truth had finally been returned to its rightful owner. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.